The Watchful Eyes of Felix. Kendra and James had been house hunting for months when they finally found the perfect home. It was a large Victorian house on the edge of town, perched at the end of a long, winding driveway. The house was much larger than anything they'd seen in their price range, with high ceilings, intricate woodwork, and a sprawling backyard. It had been on the market for years, and the price had dropped to something they could actually afford. There had to be a catch, but they couldn't figure out what it was. The couple was no stranger to owning pets, especially cats, and just before they had moved in, they'd adopted a new kitten from the local shelter. Felix, a tiny, energetic black and white tabby, seemed like the perfect addition to their home. Kendra had fallen in love with him instantly, and James had always been a cat person. Felix was a bundle of energy from the moment they brought him home. He chased his tail, pounced on imaginary prey, and turned the couple's moving boxes into an endless playground. They loved his playful antics, and his friendly nature won over everyone who came to visit. He purred loudly when held and snuggled in bed with them every night. It was as if he knew he belonged with them. But as the first few days passed, something odd began to happen. Felix started acting strangely. At night, his playful energy turned into erratic behavior. He would hiss at seemingly empty corners of the room, arch his back, and run around as if something invisible was chasing him. His bright green eyes would follow something Kendra and James couldn't see, and more than once, they were woken by the sound of him growling or scratching at the walls. Kendra laughed it off at first. "He's just a kitten," she said. "He's probably just hyper." But Felix's behavior only got worse. One night, after they had settled into bed, Felix bolted out from under the covers, hissing wildly. His fur stood on end as he stared into the dark corner of the room. His growls grew deeper, more aggressive, as if he was warning something or someone away. James sat up, his brows furrowed. "What's he hissing at? There's nothing there." Kendra groaned, rubbing her eyes. "Maybe it's a mouse, or the house creaking. Old places make weird noises." But even after a thorough search of the room, they found nothing. Felix, however, remained agitated, pacing around the house like a guard on patrol, his eyes darting toward empty spaces. Every few hours, he'd let out another angry hiss or scratch at the walls with wild intensity. After a few sleepless nights, both Kendra and James were at their wits' end. "I love Felix, but we can't go on like this," Kendra said, sitting at the breakfast table with dark circles under her eyes. "Every cat we've ever had that acted like this had some kind of anxiety or personality disorder. This is different." James nodded, exhausted. Maybe he's just not adjusting well to the new house. Or maybe something's bothering him we can't see. "Like what?" Kendra asked, half joking. "Ghosts?" James chuckled. "Well, considering how cheap this house was, who knows? People love to make up stories about old houses being haunted." That afternoon, while James was working in the backyard, their neighbor, Mrs. Holloway, an elderly woman who had lived on the street her entire life, came over to chat. She was a kind woman, always smiling and ready to share stories of the neighborhood. As they spoke, the topic of the house came up. "You're brave to move into that house," Mrs. Holloway said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. James raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Holloway leaned closer. "Well, I suppose no one told you, did they? That house has been empty for years, and not because it's in bad shape. People say it's haunted. There were stories about the last family that lived there. They left in the middle of the night, never came back. James laughed awkwardly. Come on, Mrs. Holloway. You don't believe in that stuff, do you? The old woman's eyes twinkled with a mix of amusement and concern. Oh, I'm too old to be frightened by ghost stories, but something's not right about that house. You might want to keep an eye on your kitten. Animals, especially cats, they can see things we can't. James brushed it off, but the conversation stuck with him. He didn't mention it to Kendra, not wanting to add to the stress they were already feeling with Felix's strange behavior. That night, however, Felix's actions became more disturbing. Around midnight, Felix bolted out of bed again, this time racing out of the room and down the hall. His yowls echoed through the house as he scratched at the front door, desperate to get out. When James opened the door to calm him, Felix tore across the yard, disappearing into the darkness. Kendra rushed to the window, watching Felix dart around the property like he was chasing or being chased by something invisible. I'm really starting to think something's wrong with him, Kendra said, her voice tinged with worry. But James felt something else. A creeping unease had settled over him ever since Mrs. Holloway's story. He didn't believe in ghosts, he was too logical for that, but there was something about Felix's behavior that unsettled him on a deep, instinctive level. The next morning, they decided they couldn't take any more sleepless nights. I can't believe we're doing this, Kendra said as she placed Felix in his carrier. But it's not fair to him. If there's something here that's scaring him, maybe we need to find him a new home. They had already arranged to give Felix to a woman down the street, a sweet retiree named Martha who adored animals and had no pets of her own. Martha had agreed to take Felix in, eager to give him a loving home where he could relax and stop his frantic behavior. As they handed Felix over to her, Kendra couldn't help but feel a deep pang of guilt. Felix meowed softly from inside the carrier, his big green eyes staring up at them with a mixture of confusion and sadness. Take good care of him, Kendra said, her voice cracking. He's a good boy. He just doesn't seem to like the house. Martha smiled reassuringly. Oh, I'll spoil him rotten. Don't you worry. That night, for the first time in days, the house was quiet. Kendra and James went to bed early, the exhaustion from sleepless nights finally catching up with them. But just as they were about to drift off, an icy chill swept through the room. The temperature dropped, and Kendra instinctively pulled the blankets tighter around her. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from downstairs, followed by the sound of footsteps, heavy, dragging footsteps. James shot out of bed, his heart pounding in his chest. Did you hear that? Kendra nodded, her eyes wide with fear. What was that? They both stood still, listening intently. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, as if something or someone was moving through the house. James grabbed the baseball bat he kept under the bed and motioned for Kendra to stay behind him as they cautiously made their way down the stairs. Every step felt like a weight pressing down on their chests. The air was thick with a sense of dread neither of them could explain. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, the footsteps stopped. But the house was filled with an unnatural, oppressive silence. The kind of silence that felt alive, like it was watching them. I don't see anything, James whispered, scanning the dark living room with his flashlight. But just as the words left his mouth, a deep, guttural growl came from the corner of the room. Kendra gasped, clutching James's arm as they turned to face the source of the noise. A figure, a dark, shifting mass, stood in the corner, its shape indistinct but undeniably menacing. The growl grew louder, and the air around them seemed to ripple with a dark energy. The temperature dropped further, and their breath became visible in the icy air. Kendra's heart raced as she backed away, her mind spinning. "What is that?" James didn't answer. He was frozen in place, his eyes locked on the growing shadow. The entity seemed to pulse with malevolence, its form flickering like a candle about to extinguish. Suddenly, from behind them, there was a familiar sound. A loud meow cut through the darkness. They turned to see Felix standing at the front door, his fur puffed up and his eyes glowing with fierce intensity. The kitten let out another growl, this time directed at the shadowy figure in the corner. Felix's presence seemed to disrupt whatever was in the house. The shadow began to shrink, retreating into itself as if it were terrified of the small cat. The oppressive air lifted, and the growling stopped. Felix marched forward, hissing at the remaining shadows, and the entity backed away, disappearing into the walls. The house fell silent once more. Kendra rushed over to Felix, scooping him into her arms. He purred softly, his body relaxed and calm, as if he had just completed a routine task. "I don't believe it," James muttered, lowering the bat. He scared it away. Kendra hugged Felix tightly, tears welling in her eyes. He was protecting us. The whole time, he was trying to warn us. They didn't need any further convincing. The very next morning, Kendra and James packed their bags and made arrangements to move back to the city. There was no way they were staying in that house any longer. Felix had saved them, and they weren't about to take any more chances. As they drove away from the old Victorian, Felix sat calmly in Kendra's lap, his eyes half closed in contentment. "We'll never doubt you again," Kendra whispered, stroking his fur. "You're our little hero." Back in the city, the couple showered Felix with love and affection, grateful for the kitten who had protected them from the unseen horrors of their old home. And while they never talked much about what had happened in the house, they knew one thing for certain. Felix wasn't just a normal kitten. He was something far more special. And as long as he was with them, they would always be safe.